Postmodern Condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard. 8. The narrative function and the legitimation of knowledge. Today, the problem of legitimation is no longer considered a failing of the language game of science. It would be more accurate to say that it has itself been legitimated as a problem, that is, as a heuristic driving force. But this way of dealing with it, by reversing the situation, is of recent date. Before it came to this point, scientific knowledge sought other solutions. It is remarkable that for a long time, it could not help resorting for its solutions to procedures that overtly or not belong to narrative knowledge. This return of the narrative in the non-narrative, in one form or another, should not be thought of as having been superseded once and for all. A crude proof of this: what do scientists do when they appear on television or are interviewed in the newspapers after making a discovery? They recount an epic of knowledge that is in fact wholly unepic. They play by the rules of the narrative game. Its influence remains considerable, not only on the users of the media, but also on the scientists' sentiments. This fact is neither trivial nor accessory. It concerns the relationship of scientific knowledge to popular knowledge, or what is left of it. The state spends large amounts of money to enable science to pass itself off as an epic. The state's own credibility is based on that epic, which it uses to obtain the public consent its decision-makers need. It is not inconceivable that the recourse to narrative is inevitable, at least to the extent that the language game of science desires its statements to be true, but does not have the resources to legitimate their truth on its own. If this is the case, it is necessary to admit an irreducible need for history, understood, as outlined above, not as a need to remember or to project, but on the contrary, as a need to forget. We are anticipating ourselves, but as we proceed, we should keep in mind that the apparently obsolete solutions that have been found for the problem of legitimation are not obsolete in principle, but only in their expression. We should not be surprised if we find that they have persisted to this day in other forms. Do not we ourselves, at this moment, feel obliged to mount a narrative of scientific knowledge in the West in order to clarify its status? The new language game of science posed the problem of its own legitimation at the very beginning, in Plato. This is not the proper place for an exegesis of the passages in the dialogues in which the pragmatics of science is set in motion, either explicitly as a theme or implicitly as a presupposition. The game of dialogue, with its specific requirements, encapsulates that pragmatics, enveloping within itself its two functions of research and teaching. We encounter some of the same rules previously enumerated: argumentation, with a view only to consensus, the unicity of the referent as a guarantee for the possibility of agreement, parity between partners, and even an indirect recognition that it is a question of a game and not a destiny, since those who refuse to accept the rules, out of weakness or crudeness, are excluded. There remains the fact that, given the scientific nature of the game, the question of its own legitimacy must be among those raised in the dialogues. A well-known example of this, which is all the more important since it links this question to that of socio-political authority, from the start, is to be found in books 6 and 7 of the Republic. As we know, the answer, at least part of it, comes in the form of a narrative, the allegory of the cave, which recounts how and why men yearn for narratives and fail to recognize knowledge. Knowledge is thus founded on the narrative of its own martyrdom. There is more. The legitimation effort, the dialogues of Plato, gives ammunition to narrative by virtue of its own form. Each of the dialogues takes the form of a narrative of a scientific discussion. It is of little consequence here that the story of the debate is shown rather than reported, staged rather than narrated, and is therefore more closely related to tragedy than epic. The fact is that the Platonic discourse that inaugurates science is not scientific, precisely to the extent that it attempts to legitimate science. Scientific knowledge cannot know and make known that it is the true knowledge without resorting to the other, narrative kind of knowledge, which from its point of view is no knowledge at all. Without such recourse, it would be in the position of presupposing its own validity and would be stooping to what it condemns, begging the question, proceeding on prejudice. But does it not fall into the same trap by using narrative as its authority? No. And this is not the place to chart the recurrence of the narrative in the scientific by way of the latter's discourses of legitimation, which include but are not limited to the great ancient, medieval, and classical philosophies. Endless torment. As resolute a philosophy as that of Descartes can only demonstrate the legitimacy of science through what Valéry called the story of a mind, or else in a Bildungsroman, which is what the discourse on method amounts to. Aristotle was doubtless one of the most modern of all in separating the rules to which statements declared scientific must conform from the search for their legitimacy in a discourse on being. Even more modern was his suggestion that scientific knowledge, including its pretension to express the being of the referent, is composed only of arguments and proofs, in other words, of dialectics. With modern science, two new features appear in the problematic of legitimation. To begin with, it leaves behind the metaphysical search for a first proof or transcendental authority as a response to the question, how do you prove the proof? Or, more generally, who decides the conditions of truth? It is recognized that the conditions of truth, in other words, the rules of the game of science, are immanent in that game, that they can only be established within the bonds of a debate that is already scientific in nature, and that there is no other proof that the rules are good than the consensus extended to them by the experts. Accompanying the modern proclivity to define the conditions of a discourse in a discourse on those conditions is a renewed dignity for narrative cultures, already noticeable in Renaissance humanism and variously present in the Enlightenment, the Sturm und Drang, German idealist philosophy, and the historical school in France. Narration is no longer an involuntary lapse in the legitimation process. The explicit appeal to narrative in the problematic of knowledge is concomitant with the liberation of the bourgeois classes from the traditional authorities. Narrative knowledge makes a resurgence in the West as a way of solving the problem of legitimating the new authorities. It is natural in a narrative problematic for such a question to solicit the name of a hero as its response. Who has the right to decide for society? Who is the subject whose prescriptions are norms for those they obligate? This way of inquiring into socio-political legitimacy combines with the new scientific attitude. The name of the hero is the people. The sign of legitimacy is the people's consensus, and their mode of creating norms is deliberation. The notion of progress is a necessary outgrowth of this. It represents nothing other than the movement by which knowledge is presumed to accumulate. But this movement is extended to the new socio-political subject. The people debate among themselves about what is just or unjust, in the same way that the scientific community debates about what is true or false. They accumulate civil laws just as scientists accumulate scientific laws. They perfect their rules of consensus just as the scientists produce new paradigms to revise their rules in light of what they have learned. It is clear that what is meant here by the people is entirely different from what is implied by traditional narrative knowledge, which, as we have seen, requires no instituting deliberation, no cumulative progression, no pretension to universality. These are the operators of scientific knowledge. It is therefore not at all surprising that the representatives of the new process of legitimation by the people should be at the same time actively involved in destroying the traditional knowledge of peoples, perceived from that point forward as minorities or potential separatist movements, destined only to spread obscurantism. We can see, too, that the real existence of this necessarily abstract subject depends on the institutions within which that subject is supposed to deliberate and decide, and which comprise all or part of the state. The question of the state becomes intimately entwined with that of scientific knowledge. But it is also clear that this interlocking is many-sided. The people, the nation, or even humanity, and especially their political institutions, are not content to know. They legislate. That is, they formulate prescriptions that have the status of norms. They therefore exercise their competence not only with respect to denotative utterances, concerning what is true, but also prescriptive utterances with pretensions to justice. As already said, what characterizes narrative knowledge? What forms the basis of our conception of it? Precisely that it combines both of these kinds of competence, not to mention all the others. The mode of legitimation we are discussing, which reintroduces narrative as the validity of knowledge, can thus take two routes, depending on whether it represents the subject of the narrative as cognitive or practical, as a hero of knowledge or a hero of liberty. Because of this alternative, not only does the meaning of legitimation vary, but it is already apparent that narrative itself is incapable of describing that meaning adequately.